there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's 9 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 2001, and a Sydney nurse has just returned home after a night shift at a nearby hospital. Her 18-year-old son emerges from the house and tackles her to the ground. She manages to break free, but pretty soon her ex-husband and her 15-year-old daughter join in. They drag her into the front yard, where the two men attack her with knives. Her ex screams at her that she is Satan and that she's going to die. She does. In broad daylight, in her front garden, while horrified neighbours watch on in shock. It also horrified the first responders who worked on it. And it was the final straw for one of the detectives who worked closely on the case. It was a crime so horrible, so unimaginable, that after more than a decade in the force, Luke Taylor started to think about retirement. He credits this case as the one that started the whisper in his mind. I've had enough. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. For 14 years, Luke worked across New South Wales investigating some of the most heinous crimes you can imagine. Homicide, armed robbery, drugs, undercover work, child protection and sex crimes. He's done it all. As time went on, Luke's mental health began to suffer, until he eventually bowed out of the police force for good in 2009. Now, he's a teacher, but he's found a way to combine his former career with his new profession in an experimental learning workshop called Crime Story, where he literally stages a crime scene for his students to solve. Luke joins us now. Luke, plonk me into your reality in the early 2000s. Where were you at in your life and career at that point?
Early 2000s, I was in Cabramatta at the time, which was a very exciting place to work as a young police officer, young detective. A lot of action, a lot of drugs, a lot of violence, unfortunately, but I think that's the thing you're drawn to initially. I know I was. It's the action. You want to be working on big, important cases. From there, I went and did a short spell at Windsor Police as a detective there, and then moved to child protection and sex crimes.
So you'd already been in the force, and particularly in detectives, for quite a while by this point.
Yes.
Before we get into your involvement in this case, can you tell me a bit more about the family situation of a Sydney nurse who was killed outside her home in October 2001?
Yes, well, we're aware that she had an AVO and there was a family breakdown. The young teenage daughter was still living at home with her, and her estranged husband and her elder teenage son moved out. So they were living quite some distance away, and they were separated, and there were some ongoing interactions with them. Nothing that had really caused too much alarm at that stage. However, there was an AVO, and as it turned out, another officer who I was working with had spoken to her probably a week or two before this incident, and she actually came into the police station and said, look, he's going to kill me one day. It's going to end like that.
What can you tell us about the circumstances that led up to what happened to her? Because it was quite a strange and evolving situation in the 12 hours before she died.
Yes, well, the husband and the son, they lived in Katoomba at the time, and look, they were heavy pot smokers. The effects that has on schizophrenia and different things like that is just absolutely incredible. So in that time, they had been smoking and consumed a lot of pot, and there was a history of devil worshipping and things like that. Somehow during the night, they formed the belief that mum had died in a car accident, or the ex-wife had died in a car accident, and that it was their responsibility to exorcise the demon from her body.
It's just something you don't expect, right? Like in a DV case, it's just kind of taking it to that whole other level of bizarre.
We talk about, once-in-a-lifetime cases, and that's certainly one of them, and it's one that's lived with me, and I know every other police officer that was involved in that particular case. It was absolutely horrendous, the impact it had on them, and also, as we'll find out, the civilians who were also witnesses and involved in what actually transpired.
Let's talk about that, because the nurse, she was 35-year-old woman living in Sydney. She came home from a night shift,
yes,
around 8:45, 9 a.m. in the morning. What happened to her?
So during the night, the estranged husband and son had made their way down. They caught a train, and it was quite a lengthy journey to get from Katoomba out to one of the northwestern suburbs out past Windsor. They made their way down, arrived at the house, and the daughter let them into the house. They explained the situation to her, and the words that were basically used was that Mum has died in a car accident, and when she or who we think might be her comes home in the morning, it's actually not her, it's the devil, and we have to exorcise her. So they held like some sort of cultish ritual in the house. There were glasses that were filled with wine that was purported to be like drinking blood and things like that. And so they'd convinced her as well. So they were quite in a frenzy by this particular time. And then, like I said, about 8:30 in the morning, Mum has finished her shift at Westmead Hospital and come home. As she's basically putting the key into the screen door or the front door to open there, they have just, all three of them, launched through the door armed with kitchen knives and started stabbing and attacking her and chasing her. She was able to ring 000, and throughout the next couple of minutes, as she was chased over the road, down the street, she was relaying what was actually happening. So she's run over the road. Now, at the time, there's also a couple of young schoolgirls with their mum who were waiting to catch the bus to go to school. I think they were primary age.
Broad daylight.
It is, yeah. Absolutely amazing. And then they've run past her, run into the house over the road, tried to use the phone off the wall. They've chased her through into the backyard. They've ripped the phone off that wall in that house. They've chased her into the backyard. She's come around and ended up about another 2 houses down before they've eventually caught up with her. When we played this 000 call back, so this was going live, and obviously the calls went over police radio, so we've head out there. And when we played the tape back, I remember my boss at the time basically said, lock it away in the evidence cabinet. No one is to hear that tape again.
It was just too intense.
Too intense. And obviously police, even though we're dealing with the trauma and horrible events, there is that curiosity as well. And there's a lot of people, they said, okay, I'd like to hear that for whatever reason. And it's not morbid, it's not black, it's more the fact that I think it's the way we're wired, we're investigators. There's an unknown element, and there is that fascination, and it might be hard for listeners to understand that, but it's about understanding the processes. But our boss just said, no, lock it away. That will be too traumatic for people to listen to.
Well, you were one of the first on the scene, weren't you?
Yeah, it was interesting because I'd had an operation just recently, and most of my office was actually at a district court matter for a previous matter over at Penrith. And I'd only just arrived at the station, and I just had a foot operation, so I was sitting around with my foot in a moon boot. So the uniform guys were first off, and I've jumped in one of the cars and gone out there. When we've turned up, I remember the uniform guys and girls were there. They'd sprayed them with capsicum spray. They were standing around the body and they were chanting and words about Mephistopheles and Beelzebub, all these devil references. They wouldn't leave her, and so they basically got sprayed and then chucked in the back of the paddy wagon. And even in the back of the paddy wagon, when I've got there, you could still hear them carrying on with this cultish devil stuff that they were sprouting.
The outpouring of grief from her death, can you describe that and what that was like to witness?
Yeah, that was massive, and that's, for me, one of the big things that hit me, because our coroner is at Westmead. As coroner's liaison officer, and the fact that I was on restricted duty, it just made sense that I would go down for the autopsy. And because that was in the same hospital where she worked, her colleagues and friends, they were gathered around, and I've never felt anything like it. I have never to this day felt anything like it. And that outpouring of emotion. And then there was a service in the chapel at the hospital as well, that they said, look, we can have a few minutes of a service if you want to come up for that. And it was next level.
This case is obviously horrible, but as a detective, you were pretty used to horrible by this stage. What was it about this particular case that ultimately made you want to leave, started that process for you of wanting to leave the job?
A lot of it I actually put down to a communication barrier that in some ways I had built up. Like working in Cabramatta with Vietnamese populations, there was always a language barrier. And whilst you could see and feel grief and things, it never really had that same impact. Now, I've never had anything with a family like this one,
right,
which also played into it. But there was definitely some things where I was at a point even where I'm thinking, am I that cold that I'm not actually feeling a lot of the stuff? I was almost robotic.
And this is the cases before this?
Cases before that. And also, as coroner's liaison officer, it meant oversighting deceased, so murders, suicides, accidental deaths, natural deaths, overdoses, and maintaining that. And there was like well over 100 a year, not all murders. And there is that coldness to it where you're putting on your hat and okay, there's a process and you go through that. And I think that's what a lot of us do for survival. There's also a lot of gangland stuff that was going on. So there's a lot of retribution. It was all over the drugs. It was the heroin capital of basically the southern hemisphere of the world at that stage. And there's a lot of gangland violence and didn't have that same emotional impact as when you have that family unit and kids involved, kids witnessing it. And this was just like a little suburban place where we all grow up.
From there, once you'd had that big emotional reaction, did you find it harder to emotionally detach once you'd experienced that?
I look back now and realise that for me that was the start of basically the end. I started questioning myself, questioning life and purpose and things like that, and just not knowing. So yeah, I look back now, I can definitely say that was a turning point.
This was a few years later that you actually ended up leaving, but you checked yourself into a mental health facility after retiring.
Yeah.
Tell me about that decision.
That actually came a bit later. So after that, I went to child protection and working with sex crimes. And again, I got to the point where I'm looking around at so many people harming each other, again, gangland, drugs, things like that. And I'm thinking, what purpose am I serving? Who am I helping? And I looked around and I thought, this would be cool. I went into it with such a little idea. And I remember when I went for the interview for child protection and the superintendent, she said, what do you know about our unit? And I basically said, oh, you investigate, you deal with kids. Do you know any more? No. It was only the fact that I had a little bit of experience as a detective. And they said, okay, come on in. And I fell in love with it, particularly working with teenagers. Just loved it. I had a couple of stepkids the same age, and I was just attracted to that, helping these kids. You get kids who perhaps no one believes them, they're victims in their home, different things, and you could actually see and feel you're actually doing something. And that was good for a while. I had my daughter around about that time as well. And then you have those obvious implications where you're raising a kid and you're going to work and you're seeing abused kids and then the same age as your little girl when you're going home. And that just kept building, I suppose. And then you reached a point where you just wake up one morning and you just can't do it.
Was it taboo for you to go to a mental health facility as a detective?
I think I was on the crossover. When we went to child protection, we used to have quarterly psych appointments and I was showing signs. And I got to the point where I was talking very openly to the psychologist or counsellor that we were sent to, showing a lot of signs. I raised this with the police medical officer, the PMO. Unfortunately, still don't think they treated it as well as they perhaps do now and understand that. And they sent me back in the field They said, no, you're good. It's good to be angry and and act the way you are. And here's your gun. Off you go back to work. And I think, I knew something was wrong. And I had a couple of times I took a bit of time off work. I went back, a little bit more time. And in the end, it just absolutely cracked and basically couldn't even leave the house. And that took years. I think in the end, I'd had to retell my story to about 18 different shrinks, such as the process. It's not an easy process, and that's a difficult thing, and you're constantly being put under examination, not just by medicos, but every party who's involved. And it's like they're testing you to see if you can come back or you can't come back. There's a lot of harassment as well that went on. They didn't handle it really well. And my own doctor had to basically send them a letter saying, listen, you've got to give this guy some space. Just back off everything. It was probably about an 18-month to 2-year process to actually get out of the police. And in that time, constantly revisiting and going through, weekly, sometimes twice weekly appointments, medication. And then I was out of the police. So once I was officially out, but it was then a couple of years later, I realised there was so much stuff that I hadn't properly dealt with, even though I'd been so studious and hard-working with my psych and going through stuff. There was still some stuff that just came back. And that bit me on the backside harder than what I thought, because here I am thinking, okay, I've put that side apart. And of all things, it was a few years later, I got a phone call from headquarters in town saying, I'm going through your file here. You're an ex-police. I said, yep. And we've got like your 10 or 15-year service medal that we have to present to you. But there's a mark on your file that says don't ever contact because of PTSD and it's triggering.
Oh, okay.
I said, okay, yep. And they said, do you want to come to a ceremony and receive it? And I said, stick it in the mail.
It really sounds like they didn't treat you right, because you can't be the only police officer or detective that experiences mental health struggles in this job. It is one of the hardest jobs that a person can do. And to hear what you had to do to actually get support is insane.
It is, yeah. And I don't want to bag the police. I absolutely love the police, and I could see myself doing nothing else but the police from when I joined. And I'm at a stage now where I've come full circle and I can appreciate it. I just think that we're constantly learning and evolving. And I'm also a big believer that every single job, every single walk of life has its own pressure points. I've got a brother who's a subcontractor in the construction industry. When a job finishes, he doesn't know where his next job is. Now that's pressure. As opposed to a weekly paycheck. I see mums with pressures of having a baby, holding a house together, doing things like that. Everything has their own pressure points. As a society, we're still learning, and we're going to be learning forever with this. And my old adage is, if you've got a broken leg, you go to a doctor. If I've got a broken brain, I go to a doctor. It's the same thing to look at that now. But no, we weren't good at handling it. We were coming out of the dark ages. We'd had the 1994 Royal Commission into corruption. Things were changing in the police. They were realising there were so many hardships that weren't dealt with. A lot of that was following up on a lot of the military investigations and the military research that had been done with post-traumatic stress. I think for a long time, civilian peacekeeping, like police, was overlooked because it doesn't seem to have the same horrors as standing on a battlefield that the soldiers have. But what we've learnt in the reality is that the police are actually in that position every day, and there's also the fear of it. Again, we talk about domestic violence a lot because to me that's like terrorism. It's the fear of what can happen next. Policing's a lot like that. Military conflicts, some people may do a career in the military and not actually go to a hot zone. So we're starting to become a little bit more aware of that and deal with it and put those things into place. And again, we're continuing to grow now. I know the police stations and patrols now are actually getting to the point where they're assigning a station counsellor or psychologist who you can actually go to. That's great. We've got to keep putting those things, but it's going to be time before each individual can say, I'm not afraid to walk through that door and have people see me do that. Because that matter about the nurse that we're talking about, after that incident, the police response was, we better do a welfare check and send out a counsellor. Everyone involved, there may have been 20 or 30 police involved, basically everyone on that day. They turn around and say, oh, we're doing it at about midday on Saturday. Everyone said, we're not working that day. We're not paying you to come in. It's voluntary. So it's minimal staffing on that Saturday. Anyway, everyone came in. We sat in this big room. Council sits in the middle. Now we've got like the toughest 30-year veterans sitting there. Everyone's got their arms crossed, assuming this pose. And this lovely council sits in the middle and says, it must have been traumatic. Who'd like to share their feelings?
Oh, gosh. In a room full of your colleagues.
And there's everyone there from a first-year constable to a 30-year veteran, and you've still got that vibe that I'll deal with it myself, and I'm not going to blurt out in front of everyone how I actually feel. It was just so awkward.
So they meant well. They just weren't doing it in the right way.
Yeah, and a lot of those measures, there's massive gaps in it. Like the quarterly appointments that I used to go to for when I was in child protection. There was one day I remember basically on my knees and I'm crying, talking to this counsellor, and I say, this is about the 5th appointment in a row that I've told you how I'm feeling and what's going on. I said, are they listening?
Timing-wise, we're talking about the mid to late 2000s. So I would hope that in 2024 the processes look a bit better. I know that you haven't been in the cops for a while, but from what you've seen, is it improving?
Yeah, well, I still keep in contact with a number of colleagues, and that's where I heard that they are trying to put in, if they haven't already, counsellors or health professionals at a station basis, and that would be great. That would
Hopefully
be fair.
one-on-one, not in a group.
Not in a group, but again, it's that stigma of, like, it would be almost be putting an office in the middle of the police station with this big red door. You go into that and people are all going to be going, oh, what's wrong with him? What's wrong with her? They got head noises. That was always the expression, oh, you got head noises. And you'd hear people talk about, oh, Billy Bloggs, I don't think he'll ever be back. And then someone would return from long-term sick. And I remember thinking it was like a disease. It was a mystery and it was really hard and people were awkward around them as well. It's just, it was treated like we don't want to catch that. You just had to put up this absolute bullshit macho defence, whether you're a female or a male. It was just the machismo that had to be there. Push it down.
Is there anything you miss about being a detective?
The intellectual engagement, the critical thinking. Very few cases, though, are as interesting as the ones we see on TV. Most of them are cut and dried. But still, it's the challenge of covering all of your bases with time and money, of course. Everything is investigated to a budget. Your alibi evidence, your other witnesses, and just putting that tight brief of evidence together. And particularly what I found in child protection, you want to put together the most perfect brief of evidence, because when you first present and serve your brief of evidence on the defence, you want them to look at it and go, okay, that's tight. You want to do everything to avoid that child going to court to give evidence. Even though it's done remotely, through video, through camera, they're not in the same room, there's still a massive intimidation, and you don't want to put the family through that. So you don't want any gaps in your evidence. You want it so tight that they look at it and go, yeah, we can't beat this, we'll plead guilty. And for me, probably 99% of my briefs ended that way. You just spend that little bit more time, make sure it's airtight. Yeah, I love that challenge of it.
Because there is that part of your job where you can do everything possible as the detective in the case, but then there's a point where you have to pass it over to the legal system and for them to actually find the conviction or the answer or the jail time. Is that hard, watching that process, if it doesn't go the way you wanted it to go?
It can be hard, completely. And one of the things that I teach in the workshops that I do, and we talk about ethics, morality, law, where they all come together. At the end of the day, like the DPP who prosecute our matters, there is a public interest that they have to serve. And I often talk about a murder that we investigated, and he was charged with murder, willing to plead guilty to manslaughter with interfere with a corpse. And the DPP had to weigh that up and they think, okay, we know what his defence is. He's going to say it was self-defence because that's what he told us in an interview. He killed a guy, but they're saying, okay, if he pleads guilty to these, we'll get 8 years. If we take on the murder, if he gets acquitted, if one of the jurors believes his story of self-defence, then we could have spent $2 or $3 million on a lengthy trial of taxpayer money and get nothing.
Which civilians won't really understand when they watch it from the outside.
And I watched it as they explained to the mother of this victim, and it's a bitter pill to swallow.
It's like, but why?
Yeah, it's a reality. That can really wear you down. So I think the way to survive is to treat it like a horrible game. It really is. And you have this belief that, okay, there will be justice at some stage, something will come around, whether you believe in karma or things like that. But you've just got to be happy knowing that you have done everything that you can.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Luke Taylor about his time as a detective. Up next, Luke tells us about what he did after he made the decision to leave policing behind. The techniques that you used as a detective, are there any, I guess, that listeners would be surprised by? We're used to watching TV and seeing the different techniques on the surface, but I've heard you mention cabbage before.
The old luminol, where they come into a crime scene and they spray luminol on the wall. They turn the lights off and it looks like a bloodbath.
Yeah.
And the beauty of that is it's a presumptive test for organic matter. Mm-hmm. So something that was once living. So as a crime scene fellow who tried to me once, he said, go and rub a cabbage on the wall. He said, turn the lights off and spray it, you'll get the same effect.
Really?
Yeah, it's that presumptive test. So it's the first step. We know we've got something organic. Then that will be sent away for DNA. And the other great thing that people hate to hear is that when you send a sample away, the screen doesn't split into a montage of colour and a Who song plays. And then after 10 seconds, it flashes up, suspect identified.
Bit harder than that?
And a lot longer. Yeah. Bulk crime could take months, if not years, for results to come back. And it's a numbers game.
What's more important, do you think, DNA or fingerprints in a crime scene?
Great question. I think everything is important. Well, that's a good political response. I think everything is important in a crime scene. Obviously, DNA, you could have identical twins. But then, so that's another point of elimination, whereas fingerprints are individual. It can be hard to get fingerprints at times as well, and even DNA. We've made a lot of advances in that stuff, but it's still not infallible. And DNA, like I had a job years ago where a body was cut up and we had a head, pulled the head out of the river, and it only been in the water for about 36 hours. But we could not get a DNA sample out of an entire head.
Really?
So we sent the sample to London, of all places back then, which were a little bit more advanced, to get mitochondrial DNA so we could show us the lineage of like the mother. But now we've gone so far as well that even touching this table that's in front of us is that you could pull maybe 10 samples and they're cross-contaminated.
Yeah.
And it's finding that balance. But then you've got the elimination, also fingerprints too. And one of the things I get people to do also with their mobile phone is I like to do this test with them saying, would you fingerprint or DNA? If you only had one shot at it, what would you do? And everyone obviously says, well, fingerprints. And then I say, okay, hold your phone up. So grab your phone now.
Holding my phone.
This is great for the listeners out there. You can do it all yourselves. Pick up your phone. Have a look at the points of contact.
Yeah.
Now, are you getting a full fingerprint?
No, not a single one. Even my thumb, which is on the side of my phone, is slightly raised.
Excellent. And do you have a thumb identification?
No, because nowadays you do the little click. I've got an iPhone, so I do a little click on the side.
Excellent. I've got a Samsung, and if it doesn't do facial recognition, I can put my thumbprint. But then what's the first thing I do once I open an app?
Swipe.
I swipe and smudge
So you're
it.
contaminating it.
Yes. So there's so many things. So when you get an object like that, you've got to look at the physiology. How is the object held? How was it used? Do you put the phone to your ear or do you speak into the speakerphone?
And that's going to be a different kind of DNA and fingerprint.
We don't like to admit it, but we do spit a fair bit when we talk, straight into the microphone.
I've heard quite a few former detectives, people we've had on the show, talk about the fact that nowadays it's a lot harder to get away with, say, murder because of all of the technology that we've got. Would you agree with that?
The era of ubiquitous computing, it is all around us. All those little RFIDs and things, you can track people anywhere. You walk down your street now with your phone on and civilians have the capability, but that would be picked up by so many different sources. Every building, every, like I said, RFID, all that radio frequency identification things, it sends signals everywhere. Everyone has a phone. Everyone records stuff. We have dash cams. We have phones. It's the era of constant surveillance. And it is, we can basically pinpoint. Nobody can go cold. Nobody can go off the grid. They think they can. And fortunately for us, most crimes are crimes of passion. And there's not that much forethought that goes into it.
So it's almost like your phone could be the thing that is your undoing, really. Like, could you solve a crime just by tapping into someone's phone?
That's always the thing. In any interview and things like, we won't talk about methodology, but yeah, there are so many ways. I mean, everyone knows about cell towers, triangulation. They're the basic things, and that still works. So your phone's constantly searching for 3 points in cell towers. So when you do triangulation, you put a tracer out, it keeps trying to find that phone until it narrows and narrows down, and that can be like a 10 square metre spot. So you narrow that down. It might be back out here on William Street, somewhere like that, and then you'll pick up the other surveillance cameras. You see how many people were driving in the time. It may be a traffic cam. That might pick something up. The traffic cam might actually pick up a car, and that car will have a rego, and you say, hey, have you got a dash cam in there? Yes, I have. Did you come from this street? Yes, I did. Can we check your dash cam? Businesses with surveillance, ATMs that constantly take photos of the people at the ATM, but also the people who are walking behind them. You go to Coles now the other day. I'm putting my credit card in at the Coles tap and go section because they don't have enough staff to serve me. And it's taking photos of me. My photo comes up on the screen.
There's a little video.
I know. I do my hair, make sure it's all looking good, but it's everywhere.
After the police force, I mean, you've already alluded to it, but you did become an educator. You went and restudied. Tell me about how you landed on that as your next career, and particularly in creating this workshop, these crime stories.
Yeah, I became a teacher by accident. So a few years out, I just had to re-engage my brain. I'd done a lot of reading and research, and so one thing I loved was literature. And then it was years later, I thought, why am I trying to fit myself into someone else's box? Just do what I love. And so I picked up a couple of subjects on literature, so 18th century English poetry, Shakespeare and things like that. And for 2 years, I was just doing subjects, and I thought, I'm going to be a writer or a journo.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I thought, I want to be an alcoholic journalist, you know.
There's a stereotype for you.
I know, it's a bit like the alcoholic police, isn't it? It's the same thing.
Same stereotype.
Yeah, and I started doing those subjects. Did my prac, and then after about 2 weeks of observation, I got to stand up nervously in front of these year 10 kids because they're not judgmental.
I love that you're nervous about year 10 kids when you have come from the world of crime.
So I was trying to say to them, look, at 21, I'm running around with a gun on my hip. I said, and then mid-30s, here I'm shaking like a leaf in front of these year 10 kids. But it just came out of me. I started talking about literary techniques and things, and I sat down and thought, oh, I'm not even working. This is just amazing. And I get to share my enthusiasm and just watch people respond to that, and I absolutely loved it. It was basically just glorified babysitting in a particular school. I got to work there. I signed on. This school I'd never been to before, and I went and locked myself in the toilets. I was soaking wet. I'm pulling hand towels off the wall, sticking them down my shirt, and it was a make or break moment. I thought, I just want to run home. I'm in tears. I'm sweating. I can't move. I was just paralysed again. Yeah, that moment I went out, I did a lesson, and luckily that got me through. But yeah, and you still get days like that. You still have days like that. Everything is a challenge, but I know I'm not going to die.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. And I know for most cases I'm not putting myself in that position that I was, that the police are doing every day now. My heart goes out to them for they're still doing it.
Well, eventually you found a way to kind of combine your two loves, detective work and teaching. If I was to walk into one of your workshops, crime story workshops, what would I find, or what would be presented to me?
Well, you wouldn't solve it. I don't think you're good enough.
What? I could do it, right? Is this what the kids all say?
Oh, they pick up the first piece of evidence and they're doing, I got this, I've got this. And it is so convoluted and twisting and turning with exculpatory, inculpatory evidence, or red herrings as people like to call them in the literary world. it messes with their minds.
So they literally walk into a crime scene that you set up.
So we set them up. So we have these digitally printed backdrops. They're 6 metres long, 2.5 metres tall, big aluminium frame, and they go over the top of that. And we have one on each end of the room. So there's 2 crime scenes in front of that, and they're based on real crimes that I've investigated. So we put components together of that. And all the exhibits are laid out, the evidence markers, and there's about 8 evidence markers. So there's hundreds of exhibits, and they've got to work their way through that. And then they'll cross over at the midway point and do the other investigation. And then if you're doing a full day one, maybe we're doing legal studies, or for the corporate workshops, we'll do conversation management. They actually get to interview a couple of witnesses. I get to play Gary the Garbo, and I play hardball.
What do they learn by basically playing detective? Like, how does that help them?
Mine originally was based on writing. So I went and got a Master's of Writing. And while I'm sitting in class, I'm watching these kids struggle with the concepts of writing. The school I went to was big on project-based learning, and we were taught to do that. And I took some kids who were really low literacy. I actually said to them, "You want to come and make a video game?" I said, "Let's make Grand Theft Auto." And what I did, I used these objects, this experiential learning. So we basically described our observations and what we were doing. I parked the car in the bush, left the doors open. We got to it and said, "Right, the offenders are gone. Which way did they go?" And we would record our observations. So over the course of a week, these guys put together a brilliant piece of writing for guys who could hardly write. So I then looked into experiential learning and thought, right, if we do this properly, there are better ways to teach these kids.
So I'm imagining for someone to help them with English, it's like by sitting there and having to describe pieces of evidence, that's going to help them with the way they use their words in their writing.
Completely. So I start the workshop with one of my stories. I then get them to become detectives. I say, okay, I was the star of the show. Now you're the star of the show. What you need to be as a writer is you need to then transfer that power to the reader. So I'm saying to them, give the power to the reader. Let them solve it. It's not about you telling them your inferences and what you think you've solved. The power of simply just recording their observations at a crime scene and leaving it, you then have the power of the reader going, "Oh, I think this has happened or that's happened." You don't solve it, you build it gradually. Because it's human nature, we all want to solve things. We all want to be right and we all want to solve things. And the ability is not to tell them. You guide them. So by using your observations, even in a short piece of writing, it's powerful and it engages.
What has surprised the kids about the experience? What is the feedback you've been getting?
Even the most hard-headed teenage boy who wants to kick his football at your head and say, "This is lame, I don't want to do this." They come into it at the end of a workshop, they've got this book of all this writing, all these observations and paragraphs, and they go, "How did you get me to write?" "You tricked me." That's the thing. They get so immersed in this, knowing that it's a true crime and they can solve it and they're the clues, that they start acting the way they always do. And that's when we can work with them, work with their strengths and say, right, this is your natural ability. Let's move this. Let's work with that. It's a real eye-opener. They don't know what they're actually doing and how much they're achieving. And we reflect back on that throughout the day.
Do you ever hold a session with these kids and think, oh, that kid could be a detective?
Oh, yes. I'm amazed, particularly girls. They are obsessed with true crime.
They are.
They know more than me. They are amazing. The things that they tell me, I just go, wow. It's scary, and I love it. It's the way they think. And I've got to say that 80% of the kids in school who can really get their teeth into that, they are females. They're amazing. We were at a school the other day at Lucas Heights. They were fantastic, and the boys were really good as well, but they were all high-performing kids, and these guys were fantastic. But generally it's the girls, and it's the way they think. They just go deep into it. There's a lot. The boys can be quite shallow. I was one of them. Still am, but I've grown up a bit. And surface level, whereas these girls go, what if? And they just go deeper and deeper, and it's fantastic.
So does it give you confidence? Obviously, we do have amazing people in the police force now, but for the future of the police force, and are you hopeful that when these kids that you're teaching maybe one day become detectives, that they are going to have that support and be in that career for decades and decades and decades and be able to kind of continue that job?
That would be amazing because I think the average career is down to about 3 years now.
Really?
It was about 7 when I got out.
3 years?
Yeah. And it's a similar thing to teaching. What I'm seeing, obviously having been in both industries, so when I joined, you had people, you could have a trade or you could have an HSC to get into the police. Then once we got out, we had to do like a constable's development program, which is basically to get you an advanced diploma. My detectives course was an advanced diploma, and then it's now a degree level. And I think that they're going to have 5, 6 careers. I've done a lot of careers work in schools. They're going to have 5 or 6 careers.
But that's a shame with police because seniority is important.
It's amazing. Yes, that accumulated knowledge, you can't just buy that. You cannot read a book to get that. You've got to earn that, and it takes time. And it scares me that that knowledge can just disappear.
Well, hopefully all those smart girls and boys that you're teaching will one day get there.
Yeah, and it's that critical thinking. And again, it's what they also realise, and we try to help them realise, which may not be good for the police, is they're transferable skills. They can use that anywhere. That's the essence. You can train at anything, but if you've got communication, literacy, and those transferable skills and that empathy and understanding, you can be trained to do anything.
Thanks to Luke for telling us his story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Christel Cornilsen. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.